With a spring in his step, Olaf Scholtz meets the world's media, fresh from an election in which his party took first place. He has no doubt who should lead his country forward.
The voters have spoken very clearly. They have said who should form the next government. They have strengthened three parties, the Social Democrats, the Greens and the Free Democrats. So that's the clear mandate from the citizens of this country, that these three should lead the next government.
A three-party coalition has never been tried at the federal level, but with barely more than 1% of the vote separating the two main parties, and neither wanting to govern in a grand coalition with each other again, now the attention is on the smaller parties.
The two big parties have suffered heavy losses in recent years, and there needs to be a new push that comes into the government. So it's good that all the parties are talking to each other and not waiting to just be invited in for the talks.
The composition of the newly elected parliament is now clear, and one of the things that stands out, and is perhaps why we see this happening, the Free Democrats and the Greens are talking to each other, trying to iron out their differences, because together they form a large bloc in parliament, and they hope that that would strengthen their hand in any collective talks, either with Mr. Scholz's Social Democrats or with Mr. Laschet's Christian Democrats. Although he led his party to its worst ever defeat, Armin Laschet insists it can govern, despite coming second.
It's not automatically the case that either of the big parties is entitled to say which parties they will talk with, and the FDP and the Greens made clear yesterday that they want to talk to each other first, which I think is fine.
But not everyone in Laschet's governing party is putting on a brave face. Two CDU state prime ministers have suggested the party leaders should take responsibility for the defeat. No such thoughts over at Social Democrat headquarters. This is their first federal election win in almost 20 years. And soon they hope Olaf Scholtz will replace Angela Merkel as Chancellor. Dominic, Kane, Al Jazeera, Berlin.
Well, Mr. Scholz, the frontrunner to take over as Chancellor, has also been speaking about how Germany would engage with the world under his leadership.
I think the first topic for German politics will be to form a stronger and more sovereign European Union. And making this happen will have an influence on the international strategy and the foreign policy of Germany. Transatlantic partnership is of essence for us in Germany and for a government that will be led by me. And so you can rely on a continuity in this question. It is important that we understand ourselves as democracies and that we see that in the world that becomes more dangerous, it is important that we work together, even if we do have conflicts in one or the other question.
Well, let's now bring in George Loffelman. He is a lecturer in international politics at the University of Warwick, and he joins us now from Bristol. George, Olaf Scholz sounding very much like Merkel there, which was how he campaigned, really. Is this what both Brussels and Washington will have been looking for?
Yes, absolutely. I think Olaf Scholz is sending there a very strong signal for stability, for continuity. And when we think that European integration and the partnership with France and Germany's role in the EU on the one side, and transatlantic relations, the close alliance with the United States and NATO are really the two core pillars of German post-war foreign and security policy that all of the parties that are now thinking about forming a coalition, the Greens and the FDP and the SPD, fundamentally support. And I think this is a reassuring signal and a welcoming signal to capitals like Paris and Washington, in particular since the far left, the very far left, Die Linke, has no chance of being included in any government talks, and in fact barely made it into the German parliament at all this time around.
You mentioned Paris there. I do want to focus a little on the future of the EU, because in the last weeks of campaigning, the conversation really felt like it revolved around domestic policy. Germany and Merkel was such a huge part of holding the union together, defending it, really. We're now looking at potentially months of political haggling in Germany, and with an April election in France, Mr. Macron also has his hands full. So what does all of this mean for the EU now, this transition period?
Well, for now, obviously, German energies will be consumed with domestic politics, with the coalition negotiations. I think Olaf Scholtz has provided a timeline that he wants to form a coalition until Christmas. The FDP and the Greens will now meet separately to decide on a common political ground and with which partner they can see forming a coalition. So the center of gravity, the power is much more evenly distributed. But I think what is interesting is that one of the charges against Angela Merkel was that she was an effective crisis manager in the various crises, Euro crisis, Greek debt crisis, migration crisis, but she never formulated a vision for Europe. She never formulated a response, for example, for Macron's vision of a strategic Europe, a Europe that enjoys strategic autonomy. And there, I think, a government potentially led by Olaf Scholz will formulate more of a response and more of a positive reaction to these ideas.
Well, you mentioned there that these foreign policy issues don't appear to be hugely important in terms of the coalition negotiations, given that everyone seems to be on the same page. Does that mean then that you think something like, for instance, climate change might actually take center stage in the coming weeks and months?
I think in particular the SPD and the Greens are very closely aligned on their climate change proposals. They want to make Germany climate neutral by 2040, 2045. They all agree on phasing out coal. They all agree on very ambitious CO2 reduction goals. I think the stumbling block here could be the FDP, which traditionally sees solutions in terms of making Germany a greener economy more in pushing for technological innovation, less state intervention. They want to rather reduce the fees for CO2 emissions and make it easier for industry and lower taxes. But also the FDP has very ambitious climate change goals in terms of sort of like turning Germany into an industrialized yet green nation. So I think there is some common ground here to be had. And ultimately, both the FDP and the Greens want back into power after years in opposition. So I think they will be willing to compromise to a certain degree.
Sure. Well, let me ask you then, because the FDP and the Greens have really said they want to discuss things amongst themselves before they speak to anyone else, and the CDU has also said that they're going to be reaching out to them. As we've been saying, Germany has some huge challenges ahead, infrastructure gaps, this lag that we've been seeing on a green transition. They obviously need to be urgently addressed. So how long do you see this potentially all dragging out?
Well, I think politicians of the FDP and the Greens have sort of formed informal circles already over the last years to sort of like feel out the other side and feel out some of a common ground. And I think that both these parties have identified climate change as an absolute priority for Germany, both ecologically and economically, speaks to the fact that there is something of a commonality here. And I also think that both the FDP and the Greens are very conscious that together they have as much of a vote share potentially with an SPD as with a CDU partner, so they can really meet the other party on eye level. Obviously, the Greens have more of a preference for the SPD. The FDP's more natural partner is the CDU, but I think also among the FDP, there is a recognition that the CDU is somewhat of a spent force politically, personally, and that Armin Laschet is a candidate that is very unliked in Germany, and he lacks very much of a strong mandate.
Well, interesting times ahead there for Germany. George Loffelman there, a lecturer in international politics at the University of Warwick. Great to get your thoughts on Al Jazeera. Thanks for joining us, George.
Thanks for having me.